It's 7 in the morning in the kitchen in Ohio. Bill is already dressed for a doctor's appointment he mentioned once yesterday. His wife Carol asks him, again, what time they're leaving. He answers too flat. She turns to the sink a little too fast. Nobody raised their voice. 41 years married, and neither of them could tell you why that tiny exchange stung so much. If you've been married a long time, you know that moment. Not a fight, just a coldness that creeps in and leaves you wondering, quietly, if you're becoming harder to live with than you used to be. Here's what I want you to know before we go any further. That coldness is not proof the love ran out. Psychologists who study long marriages found something else is actually going on, and it has almost nothing to do with how much you love each other. For a long time, people assumed conflict like that came from two people simply falling out of love. But when psychologists studied couples married 30, 40, 50 years, they found the coldness usually shows up exactly when something invisible shifts, not affection, but roles. The one who used to handle everything without being asked starts needing to be asked. The one who used to be steady starts seeming, for the first time, a little unsteady. And the other partner feels that shift long before either of them can name it. You might be thinking, that's not it. We don't have some big role problem, we just bicker more than we used to. That's exactly how it starts, not as a crisis, but as 100 small handoffs. You start double-checking the stove even though he always checked it. You start answering for her at the pharmacy counter because she's a beat slower today. Nobody announced a new arrangement. It just happened, one Tuesday at a time. Here's the part almost no one says out loud. When your spouse changes like that, you're not only watching them get older, you're getting a preview of your own future, and that is a genuinely frightening thing to sit across the breakfast table from every morning. So the sharpness in your voice isn't cruelty, it's fear, wearing an impatient tone because it doesn't know how else to come out. Nobody teaches you that watching someone you love slow down is also, quietly, a rehearsal for watching yourself slow down one day. That double exposure is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived inside a 40-year marriage. And this isn't some rare, private struggle. Research from the Pew Research Center and the National Center for Family and Marriage Research found that divorce among people over 50 has roughly doubled since 1990, and for people over 65, it's roughly tripled. Nearly 4 in 10 divorces filed in America today involve someone over 50. Long marriages are not somehow immune to this. If anything, this is exactly where a lot of the quiet erosion happens. So today isn't about finding more patience or trying to love someone the way you did at 25. It's about understanding what's actually happening underneath the friction, and what the couples who make it 40, 50, 60 years do differently. By the end of this video, you'll have more than an explanation. You'll have the one small daily habit that keeps long marriages steady through every hard season, and something you can try in your own kitchen tonight. A Cornell gerontologist named Carl Pillemer spent years interviewing 700 of those couples to find out. Some had been married 60 years, a few even 70. Between all of them, they'd accumulated something like 25,000 years of marriage combined. And it turns out, almost none of them avoided hard seasons. They just handled 3 very specific turning points differently than most people do. The first flashpoint is retirement. For most of a marriage, a couple might spend 2 or 3 waking hours a day actually in the same room. The moment one or both of you retire, that number can jump to 12, 14, 16 hours, under the same roof, with no office to disappear into. That's not a small adjustment. It's roughly a 5-fold increase in shared time, arriving all at once. It's tempting to read the tension that follows as a sign something's wrong between you. But researchers who study the retirement transition describe the first 2 years as similar, psychologically, to the first 2 years of a marriage, or the first 2 years of parenthood. An entire renegotiation of roles and space compressed into a short window. Researchers even describe the emotional load as a mild form of shock, not because retirement is bad news, but because the brain wasn't built to reorganize 4 decades of routine in a single weekend. Here's the part that should give you hope. Studies following retired couples found that roughly 6 in 10 report their marriage actually improved once they got through that adjustment. Take a couple I'll call Diane and Walter, married 38 years, outside Phoenix. Walter retired from 31 years at the same plant on a Friday, and by the following Wednesday, Diane was hiding in the garage just to hear herself think. She told him, finally, that it wasn't that she didn't love having him home. She'd lost the only 2 hours of the day that had ever belonged only to her. It wasn't a complaint about him. It was a request for a room of her own, inside a marriage. So they built one. Walter turned a corner of the garage into what he half-jokingly calls his office, with a radio and an old workbench. Diane kept her mornings on the porch, coffee and a crossword. No conversation required until 9 o'clock. They still eat lunch together every single day. They just stopped expecting togetherness to mean the same thing for 16 hours that it used to mean for 3. The second flashpoint is health, one partner's body changing in a way that puts the other one, suddenly, in the role of caregiver. Take a woman I'll call Grace, married 46 years outside Denver, whose husband Tom had a stroke that left the left side of his body slower to obey him than it used to be. For months, she caught herself finishing his sentences before he'd gotten 3 words out, not really to help him, if she's honest, but because waiting felt unbearable. Then one evening he stopped her, mid-sentence, and said quietly, "Let me finish." That's when she understood the real work wasn't managing his body. It was managing her own impatience with how long everything now took. This flashpoint is harder than the other 2, because it isn't optional, and it doesn't resolve itself in a couple of weeks. Couples who weather it well aren't the ones who feel less burdened. They're the ones who stop treating the burden as a betrayal of how the marriage was supposed to go, and start treating it as something they're carrying together, instead of one person carrying it alone. The third flashpoint is quieter. The day the last child moves out, and you realize, somewhere around the second week, that you and your spouse have spent 20 years having most of your conversations about the kids. Suddenly, the car ride home from dinner is 15 minutes long instead of 5, and you're not entirely sure what to fill it with. That silence isn't proof you've run out of things in common. It's proof you never had to build the habit of finding them, because the kids were doing it for you. Retirement, health, an empty house. 3 moments almost every long marriage eventually walks through. What separates the couples who come out closer isn't luck. It's what they actually say to each other in the middle of it. And that's where most of us, without realizing it, are doing more damage than we think. If this is helping you understand the quiet shifts happening in your own home, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It helps these conversations find more couples who might need them right now. A psychologist named John Gottman spent decades at the University of Washington doing something almost nobody else had done. He recorded couples arguing, then followed up with them years later to see who stayed together. He could predict divorce with over 90% accuracy, not from what they argued about, but from 4 specific patterns in how they talked to each other. He called them, half-joking, the 4 horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Before I give you the fix, I want to say something you need to hear first. If you recognize these in your own kitchen, that doesn't make you a bad spouse 40 years in. It makes you tired, and tiredness makes everyone sloppy with their words. Now here's the swap that matters most. Instead of, "You never remember anything I tell you," which is criticism aimed at who they are, try, "I don't think I said that clearly. Let me say it again." Same information, completely different message underneath it. Instead of, "You wouldn't understand that anyway," which is contempt, try, "That's actually not obvious. Let me walk you through it." I call this the 10-second rewrite. You're not changing what you need to say, only who it makes your spouse out to be while you say it. Contempt tells them they're small. The rewrite tells them they're just missing information, which is a much smaller, far more forgivable thing to be. There's a third pattern worth naming too: defensiveness, the reflexive, "It's not my fault," the instant you feel criticized. The swap there is smaller but just as important. Instead of, "Well, I wouldn't have forgotten if you'd reminded me earlier," try, "You're right, I dropped that. Let me fix it." It costs you almost nothing to admit fault first. It costs a marriage a great deal when nobody ever does. Now some of you are already thinking, "Isn't that just putting on an act?" Here's the honest answer: yes, a little, and that's fine. Being deliberately gentler than you feel in the moment isn't dishonesty. It's the same discipline as biting your tongue at a funeral or staying polite to a stranger on a bad day. Couples in long, happy marriages aren't the ones who never feel irritated. They're the ones who've practiced choosing their words so many times that the kind version comes out first, almost automatically, before the sharp one gets a chance. Right now, think of the last thing you said to your spouse that came out sharper than you meant it. Or maybe it wasn't something you said at all. Maybe it was the conversation you simply walked away from, arms crossed, refusing to engage. The fourth pattern, stonewalling. That one doesn't feel like an attack from the inside, but to the person left standing alone in the kitchen, it often lands like one anyway. Just replay your own last moment for a second. Not to feel bad about it, only to notice which of the four was quietly doing the talking. Avoiding those four patterns matters. But couples in long, happy marriages aren't the ones who never slip into them. They're the ones who've built something else around the slips, a very specific ratio researchers can actually measure. Gottman's research turned up a number that's stuck with marriage counselors ever since: 5-to-1. In stable, happy marriages, for every one negative interaction, there are at least 5 positive ones. A compliment, a touch on the arm, a shared laugh, a moment of real interest. Marriages heading for divorce, by contrast, were closer to 1-to-1. Not because the happy couples fought less, because kindness was doing 5 times the work around every disagreement. The good news is that 5-to-1 doesn't require grand gestures. The positive side of that ratio is mostly made of tiny things. Noticing when your spouse walks into the room, saying thank you for something they always do anyway, resting a hand on their shoulder for no particular reason. It isn't one big deposit. It's a lot of small, almost boring ones, made consistently. One of the simplest ways to make a deposit is what I'd call the choice instead of the order. You need to go to the doctor today feels like an instruction. Should we go this morning or after lunch is the exact same appointment, but it leaves your spouse holding a little bit of the steering wheel. People who feel like they still have some say in their own day are, unsurprisingly, easier to be married to and easier on themselves. Pillamer's researchers at Cornell found something similar when they looked at who does what around the house. It wasn't the actual split of chores that predicted a happy marriage. Some couples split things 50-50, others didn't come close. What mattered was whether each partner felt the arrangement was fair. Feeling unseen in the small, daily work of a marriage does more damage than the work itself ever does. So kindness matters, and being asked instead of told matters. But there's one more thing almost none of us are taught about long marriages, and it's nearly the opposite of what you'd expect. Many people assume a good marriage means doing almost everything together. Same meals, same errands, same hobbies, same friends. But some of the steadiest long marriages researchers studied actually ran on a fair amount of separateness, on purpose. There's a couple outside Tampa, married 52 years, who described their arrangement almost matter-of-factly. Separate mornings, doing their own thing. Lunch together, without fail. Separate again most afternoons. He plays cards with the same 3 men every Thursday, a standing game since 1994. She has a garden club that meets on Tuesdays. Neither one has ever once been to the others. And by their own account, that's exactly why dinner still has something to talk about. Constant togetherness, especially after retirement, can quietly turn into something that feels like being watched rather than being loved. If your spouse asks where you're going, who you're seeing, and when you'll be back, every single time you leave the house, that's not devotion running at full strength. It's often anxiety wearing devotion's clothes, and it tends to push people toward the door instead of keeping them close to it. One husband finally put it to his wife plainly, "I'm not checking up on you because I don't trust you. I'm checking because I'm scared of the day you don't come back." She told him that was exactly the sentence he should have been saying all along, instead of the questions that made her feel cornered every time she reached for her car keys. If that sounds familiar, try protecting 1 hour a day that belongs to just one of you. No explanation required, no itinerary needed. And if there's a friend you haven't called in longer than you'd like to admit, that phone call is doing more for your marriage than you'd think. A spouse was never meant to be your only source of conversation. That's simply too much weight for one relationship, however long, to carry alone. Which brings us to the one thing that showed up, in one form or another, in nearly every long, happy marriage those Cornell researchers studied. The thing this whole video has been building toward. It wasn't a shared bank account. It wasn't never disagreeing. It wasn't even the number of years survived. Across 700 interviews, the researchers kept running into the same small, almost invisible habit. Nearly every long, happy couple had built some tiny ritual, repeated so often it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like breathing. For one couple, it was a hand held across the console every single time they got in the car, for over 50 years, without either of them ever once mentioning it out loud. For another, it was the same two words exchanged every night before the light went off. Nothing profound, just good night and love you, in that order, every night, whether the day had been good or terrible. Small, repeatable, almost boring if you didn't know what it was actually doing. Here's why something that small carries that much weight. Grief counselors who work with older widows and widowers describe this constantly. People who, months or even years after losing a spouse, still find themselves setting out 2 cups instead of 1, without quite deciding to. Researchers who study grief in later life, using a framework called continuing bonds, found that the people who adjust best after losing a spouse aren't the ones who had the fewest daily habits together. They're the ones who had the most, because those small, repeated moments become a kind of language a couple builds together, one that keeps meaning something long after almost everything else about an ordinary day has been forgotten. It's the same idea as that 5-to-1 ratio, just stretched across decades instead of a single conversation. One good ritual repeated for 40 years outweighs an enormous number of forgotten anniversaries and short tempers on hard mornings. The couples who make it aren't the ones who never had a bad decade. They're the ones who never let go of their one small, ordinary thing. I think about that a lot these days, in my own kitchen, at my own age. I didn't understand any of this in my 30s, and I'm not sure I fully understood it in my 60s either. It's the kind of thing you only really learn by living long enough to watch it work. The big promises made at a wedding are easy to say once. It's the small, unglamorous ones, the same 2 words, the same held hand, the same cup set out on the counter, that actually get kept, morning after morning, for 40 years and more. So if you remember only one thing from everything we've covered, not the 4 horsemen, not the 5-to-1 ratio, not even the Cornell study, remember this. The couples who age well together aren't the ones who never drifted. They're the ones who kept one small, ordinary ritual alive through every flashpoint, every retirement, every hard season, without ever making it a big deal. Here's something small to try tonight, before you turn off the light. Say one specific thing you're grateful for about the person next to you. Not thanks for everything, but one actual thing, from today. That's the whole assignment. Do it again tomorrow, and somewhere around the 40th time, it stops being an assignment and starts being the thing that carries you through the next 40 years. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. How many years have you and your spouse been walking this road together? And which of these flashpoints felt closest to your own kitchen table? Leave it in the comments below. Your story might be exactly the encouragement someone else needs to read today. If you know someone quietly walking through a hard season in their marriage, or you just want to share this gently with your own spouse, send it their way. And if you'd like more of these conversations about growing older with the people we love, subscribe and stay with us here. If this found its way to you today, it probably found the right person. Tonight, take one moment to look at the person across the table, and remember, they're doing this, growing older, for the very first time too. So are you. Go easy on each other.